Sharon. Okay, our next member is a longtime Conrad, and he's a member of Workers' World Party, and he's also a journalist in that newspaper. His name is Bryan Pfiefer. And he will be covering the crisis of public education and public service workers. Bryan?
All right, Bryan, welcome back.
All right, Detroit, how you doing?
All right.
All right. Son, should I do my radio voice?
Yeah.
And now we are in Detroit, Michigan. Here on Saturday afternoon. These fighting communists are going to take down this rock. All right. So, comrades, I just want to, it's a great honor to be here in Detroit. It's obvious from a distance that this party, this branch, has been playing a leading role in fighting these rotten, racist, big imperialist capitalists in this city and the banks who want to destroy Detroit and the working class and the oppressed. And it's been wonderful to see, and it's great to see you leading the struggle here. I just want to start out with saying solidarity to Ferguson, Palestine, and Detroit. The oppressed people in Ferguson and all around the world have the absolute right to resist occupation by any means and the capitalist media has got it all wrong.
Right.
The brothers and sisters and comrades and friends and oppressed people in Ferguson are not looting, they're liberating.
Right.
Yes.
From the first time a slave was captured in Africa, from today, the African people, people of African descent, oppressed people have been robbed and looted every day of their lives.
Right.
They deserve to take every single thing out of those stores. They paid for it, they worked for it, and they deserve it all. Furthermore, speaking about occupation, and here in Detroit, we know that there's not one supermarket in the city. If the oppressed people want to go to the outside of the city, they have to go to 8 Mile, take a bus, get harassed by the pigs, pulled over by the cops. The same thing in a lot of cities. So when oppressed people live in a city like Ferguson or Detroit, they're getting robbed every day, not only by the products that are being sold, but they don't even have access to these products. So if we say they have access to the products, no matter how, they need to get access.
Right.
If there's warehouses full of food, stores full of food from New Orleans back in 2005, they have the right to take what they need.
Yes.
We brought some, we always have a habit here of bringing some folks from Wisconsin, the area now known as Wisconsin, as the native people say. We have Babette and Ben here, our new candidate, and a new comrade over here from Janesville. I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to go a little bit from the concrete to the general. I'm going to talk about the view of communists in education just real briefly, and then go into some of the specific attacks that are happening. I think, as it was described today, socialists view education from a position of dialectical and historical materialism, as was discussed. And we come from a perspective that being determines consciousness, that was just mentioned, that all of our ideas flow from the economic system that we are living in. And socialists, we are talking about the state in terms of using the state to implement, develop, and consolidate public, free, universal education. The idea that education is a human right. Our concepts are knowledge for knowledge's sake, not just to get a job to be exploited. And our technical education is used to develop socialist productive forces, the means of production to improve society, lessen the burdens on the working class and oppressed through technology, not to use technology to exploit and to try to throw workers out on the streets. And fundamentally, all of our education as socialists is used to eventually build communism. That's our ultimate goal. And some of the examples historically that have been, we don't have time to discuss this, but I just wanted to raise a few examples of nation states that have been won in battles over the course of history, and also some of the forms that are being used in terms of education. Because we don't need to reinvent the wheel, because a lot of this has already been put in motion. We just need to get it in gear so we can actually start building this in the United States. So in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, there's a book, Soviet but Not Russian, that explains and some of you might need to help me with this pronunciation. And she was a revolutionary Bolshevik in her own right. Sometimes in the United States, especially in capitalist education, it said, somebody would say something like Vladimir Lenin's spouse or wife. But we say that Miss Krupskaya, she was Krupskaya. She was a revolutionary Bolshevik woman in her own right, and she helped build the education system in the USSR, which is a great model, and that was talked about or wrote about in the book Soviet but Not Russian. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Eric can help me, is it Juche? The concept, Juche. There's a concept there. In Cuba, in 1960, there was a literacy campaign. And what they did in Cuba, instead of tossing the youth out on the streets like they do in the United States when they don't make any profit for the capitalists, after the revolution, illiteracy was at some of the highest rates in the Western Hemisphere. What the Cuban comrades did when they took state power is not only about 6 months to a year, they formed a campaign. At that time, the population was about 6 to 7 million. And they sent thousands, maybe tens of thousands of youth across the entire island of Cuba to wipe out illiteracy in Cuba in the space of just a couple years after the revolution. In China, of course, that was raised today. Also in the United States, we have the great esteemed scholars and educators, communists, and that Dr. W.W.P. Du Bois here, and Mr. Paul, once again, Mrs. Eslanda Robeson, who was a great educator as well, in her own right, once again. And there's a great book that just came out on her. Also in Africa, we have Dr. Nkrumah, who wrote wonderful books on ideology for the oppressed, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And here in the United States, we had a period in the United States after the Civil War called Reconstruction. And to a great degree, public education came out of Reconstruction in the United States. And as with unions in this country, the white working class has a great deal to owe the black masses in this country for Reconstruction and the gains that were won during Reconstruction, especially in terms of public education. The idea is that in every state constitution in this country that every person has the universal right to free public education. Now, of course, there's a lot of problems with that, the way it's paid for and everything, but nonetheless, that's a right, and that came to a large degree out of Reconstruction. Our view in workers' role as well, within the context of that, is the right of the oppressed people to have their own education and to run their own education systems and have the right to community control of their education, whatever that may be. And some of the forms that have been used, and comrades mentioned the paper. This is not just a newspaper like you pick up I'll try to engage in not name calling, but the so-called Detroit Free Press and those types of capitalist rag publications. Right. This publication, Workers' World, is not just something to read, it's an organ for the working class and oppressed. It's an organizing tool that we use to educate ourselves and the masses, as was explained. And that those ideas came out of something, in history, some organs like Iskra, Granma in Cuba, etc. And today, socialists around the world, especially over the past 10 or 20 years, don't just have to rely on print publications. As we've seen in Ferguson and Occupy and the Wisconsin State Capitol occupation and the water shutoff struggle here, there are struggles right now that go international almost spontaneously and immediately, and that's part of the educational process as well. We as socialists have certain contributions to make in terms of that education. In the opposite of socialist education, of course, you have capitalism. And of course, capitalism, the only reason that they educate anybody is so they can educate the workers to exploit them as needed during given phases and develop only workers that are needed to exploit their labor power. And this changes as capitalism degenerates, inculcating capitalist ideology. Now, we've written publications called High Tech, Low Pay that was published in 1984 and was updated at Capitalism at that end, right? So we're in a period right now where millions of workers, including youth, which is some of the worst crimes of this system, is tossing millions of youth on the streets, oppressed youth, white youth, well over 50 to 70% of black youth in Milwaukee and Detroit are unemployed, underemployed, don't have any jobs. They have no future to look towards. Even if they get to college, they walk out. The average student now is walking out of a 4-year degree with $20,000 in debt, right? So capitalism, that's their idea. And high-tech, low-pay is millions of workers right now as manufacturing has declined, and not just the capital, but the means of production now are shipped all over the world. So you have a huge shift in population with, as was mentioned today, workers being pitted directly against each other from the United States to everywhere in the world. So millions of workers right now are completely superfluous in the United States, according to the capitalists. Of course, we're socialists. We think everybody has the right to a job, everybody has the right to education. But if the capitalists cannot extract labor and profit from your labor, our labor, you're out on the street. That's capital, a very broad overview of capitalists. And white workers, black workers, and typically we want to raise, and I appreciate it today that I've been spending a lot of time in the South, and that's where I live now. The role of the South is extremely important, always has been, but especially now, because in Charlotte we had a march on Wall Street South in the summer of 2012, and the largest concentration of finance capital is now in Charlotte, North Carolina. And a lot of the auto plants are now in the South. The biggest auto plants are in the South, and they weren't organized in the early 80s because of chauvinism. And now the UAW is saying to themselves, we made a big mistake, and they can't even get an auto plant to win an election in Tennessee. So all of the auto plants are down there. A lot of the finance capital is in the South. So when we think in terms of education and the things that we have to do, we have to always include the role of the South. Today, education in the United States is a multi-billion-dollar, the way that the capitalists think of it, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And it really is a multi-billion-dollar situation. When you talk about textbooks, the testing that was came out of George Bush's push by the ruling class in 1992, No Child Left Behind, there's testing provisions in there. The testing provisions are a multi-billion-dollar industry controlled by mostly 2 or 3 corporations. Yep. One of the big ones is Pearson. And our wonderful educators and teachers are strapped by this. There is laws that you have to test these students over, hours and hours and hours of time is wasted on these tests, but it makes a lot of money for these testing companies.
Yep.
When you talk about other products, you talk about textbooks, and now, of course, with the decline of capitalism, the rate of profit of plundering Latin America, Africa, Asia, and other places in the world is less and less. So now the capitalists and imperialists are looking to the workers in the United States in austerity, and education is a huge, huge part of that, because you're talking about billions, maybe trillions of dollars in talking about privatizing education, in buildings, in construction, in testing, and the big one is pensions. There's 4.5 million combined members of the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association. When you add up the pensions that those workers have right now in every state in this country, you're probably talking billions, if not trillions of dollars, and they want that money, as we see here in Detroit. So education, the other thing is, in the United States, besides the transportation sector, like as we saw, let's give a great shout out to the international longshore workers and our solidarity of shut down design and ships in the area, that besides transportation, like the ILWU, some railroad worker unions, etc. in this country, educators and staff are the largest unionized sector in this country, and there's a lot of power there. They're not just unionized, they're in our communities, right? There's schools in the communities. The educators who are a union have access to parents, they have access to children, they have access to community organizations, to churches, to civic organizations. I mean, the ruling class spends a lot of money scientifically trying to analyze this and figure this out, and they know this. So they have all intents and purposes, as we saw in Wisconsin, to completely bust the union. We saw that the Chicago Teachers Union, who gave a great resistance to the ruling class, they wanted to shut down 80 schools or more. They shut down 50, but that was, it was a victory. But nonetheless, the unions are the only thing that is stopping the ruling class from really completely privatizing education. One of the only things besides mass uprising. We're looking at charter schools, the privatization of charter schools. Busing, right? Outsourcing. In states that you have school boards, like our big struggle in Boston, right. Veolia, you're talking just on bus contracts, cafeteria contracts, you're talking a lot of money in education, a lot of money. So there's a lot to discuss on this level, but this is one of the reasons why the ruling class right now, and all these different reasons, are targeting in this particular period, along with the austerity education in particular. When it comes to the public sector beyond education, We look at the attacks on the Postal Service, right? They want to privatize and bust the Postal Service. Here in Detroit, they've laid off thousands of workers, going after the public sector pensions, and all of that struggle that's going on. So it is an all-out attack on the public sector unions with no let-up. The only thing that's stopping them is mass resistance here. Like the examples that have been given in Detroit, the only reason the banks have stopped in Detroit attacking and going further on pensions is resistance that's been done here, and that's what's going to need to happen. But really having an overall view and an anti-capitalist view and an independent view is really what's needed. And I just wanted to raise some of these ideas. We can talk about this more in discussion, and this needs that we really need research and talking to the unions and figuring out how we're going to approach this with different organizing campaigns. There's we have looking at the material basis for unity, and we talked a lot about today about the working class and the oppressed. Now, the white low-wage workers, for instance, we're from Wisconsin, so we see that the manufacturing industry there has been completely devastated. The opportunities that exist, for instance, today, the low-wage workers in the industries of McDonald's and the fast food restaurants and all these other low-wage sectors, there's a lot of material basis for unity, but the only way that this is going to happen is if there's an independent, anti-capitalist, united front formation in the communities, working with labor and getting to the unions. And those in the unions, the labor lieutenants, who think, as we saw here in Detroit for the last 30 years, the whole idea of concessions, the whole idea of collaborative bargaining, labor management proposals, that's all a ruse, it's all lies, it's not going to work. The only way forward has to be struggle. Struggle and more struggle. And fundamentally, as was mentioned many times here, the only way that we are fundamentally not only going to have a revolution, of course, but to move the class struggle forward is a party. And a party united in the working class and labor. We're from Wisconsin. We saw, you can look at Wisconsin, you can say, how, you look at some of these videos, right? And you say, how in the hell could you mess up 100,000 people, tens of thousands of people coming to your city, occupying the Capitol, and they're ready for a general strike and they're ready to move? How in the hell, as leaders of unions and community organizations, could you mess that up, right? Well, the answer is because there was no Leninism, Marxist-Leninism, right? The role of spontaneity is important. The masses rose up, they shut down the Capitol, and they sacrificed, they rode on buses, but the leadership and organization of the Leninist Party was missing. So all of that spontaneity, right, it was dissipated, and there's good struggles happening there, but right now, and we have to be honest, Lenin one time said facts are stubborn, and there is a slaughter going on in Wisconsin. AFSCME has lost tens of thousands of members. The AFT has lost anywhere between 5,000 and 8,000 members. 175,000 public sector workers in the state, at least. See, Act 10, the bill that was passed and affirmed by the Supreme Court 5-2 2 weeks ago, 175,000 public sector workers are subject to this bill, minimum, Act 10. What happens is this Act 10 says that the law states that if you want to recertify as a bargaining unit, you have to recertify as a community of interest. What that means for those who don't know about unions are, you have 300 people, you have to have a community of interest. So that means that you all kind of got to be doing the same job skills. So and then you have to certify. So traditionally, before this act, if you vote for a majority, you got 300 workers, 151 people vote, you're in. Or if 75 people vote and you get 51%, you vote your contract, it's a contract, it's law. What the Act 10 certifies is that every single annual year, you have to get 51% of the entire bargaining unit to even have a certified unit every year, right? On top of that, there was, we call a wage cut. They say increase in reforms. We say wage cuts to health care and pension costs. And the vesting time for new workers was increased, and the time that you could actually access to get into the Wisconsin pension system was increased. You can't even pay in for a certain amount of time. It was increased. So you add up all those costs. In the last year, a very conservative estimate is the working class and oppressed people have been robbed of $3 billion in Wisconsin. Where's that going? Well, we know where it's going. It's all going to the banks, right? The bonds, the bank swindles, the same things that you all talk about here in Detroit, the same things are happening in Wisconsin. So The banks have to pay, and we have a flyer in Wisconsin too. Make the banks pay. The workers did not create these situations. The banks can go to hell. They need to pay every single penny. They're the ones who rob the working class. But the only way that this is going to change, and in Wisconsin we see it, right? There's a lot of wonderful struggles. There's struggles on police brutality. There's struggle fighting austerity. There's various different low-wage worker struggles. But what's missing is a Marxist-Leninist party to direct this against the capitalist state, right? And even to this day, 3 years after, people are still talking about Walker's the one who did this. Walker's the one who did this, right? That's why we need ideology. That's why we need anti-capitalist ideology. We understand that Walker is a chump. Walker is a servant, right? They can put in Snyder's a servant, right? He may be a little bit part of the ruling class, but it's a capitalist system that's the problem, and what's moving things in the head in Wisconsin. And I just want to close by, there's a lot of, over the past few years, I've been doing a lot of reading of our comrade, Comandante Ernesto Che Guevara. And yes, he was a great and wonderful guerrilla fighter, but he was also a medical doctor, an MD, but he was also led the National Bank after the revolution, and he was also, I think, one of the best, and I think this might have been even his best quality, a communist educator. He gave many concepts and contributions to the Cuban Revolution and communists and socialists around the world. And one of them was, I think, his role of volunteerism, his concept of volunteerism, and his concept of cadre. And there's a talk that he gave in 1962 to some youth. And cadre, he talks about cadre as the backbone of the revolution. And he talked to a lot of youth in their teens and their 20s. And to this day, a lot of his concepts and his contributions are within the youth leagues in Cuba, as well as many other places in Cuban society. And I just want to close with a quote by him. And of course he says him, so that was 1962. So he talks about, he talks earlier about going on to various different situations. And he talks about the common denominator for all of these cadres is political clarity. This does not consist of unthinking support for the postulates of the revolution, but a reasoned support. It requires great capacity for sacrifice and a capacity for dialectical analysis, which will enable them to make continuous contributions on all levels to the rich theory and practice of the revolution. These compañeros should be selected from the masses solely by application of the principle that the best will come to the fore and that the best should be given the greatest opportunities for development. And I think this really goes to the heart of it. In all of these situations, the function of the cadre is the same on each of the different fronts. He's talking about mass fronts specifically. The cadre is the key component of the ideological motor that is the united party of the revolution. It is something that we could call the dynamic gear of that motor. A gear in as much as he is working part of the motor, making sure it works right. Dynamic in as much as he is not simply a transmitter of slogans or demands, upward or downward, but a creator who will aid in the development of the masses and the information of the leaders, serving as a point of contact between them. The cadre has the important mission of seeing to it that the great spirit of the revolution is not dissipated, that it will not become dormant nor slacken its rhythm. It is a sensitive position. He transmits what comes from the masses and instills in the masses the party's orientation. And I believe that's, as we as a party, that's a stage I believe we're in the United States. We're in a stage of consolidation. We have a lot of places within the party in the country where we have branches, but we also have a lot of places in the country, such as the Midwest, where you have a lot of ones and twos and various different comrades who want to fight. And I think we're in a stage where education and consolidation of our cadres and our friends and our periphery in the community, education is a huge part of that. And I just wanted to raise that going forward, we have conversations about how we can use different models from the Cubans or other comrades around the world to really think about how we can develop and build not only the party, but also our periphery and really build a united socialist front in the United States, because that's really